how much space should there be between these blocks of text? If there's too much, they start to look unrelated, but if there's too little, it's hard to make sense of the information. What should it be the same, equal between each block? What about between lines of type? Do we need to change that? Does type size affect these choices? What about if we make this title here twice as big? And what about if we introduce other elements, like maybe there's a photograph or a card or something like that to the side? How close should that be to the block of text? Do we sort of eyeball it? There's 27 pixels in between. What about if there's multiple graphics here? How do we sort of make sense of all this sort of spacing and get it work together? Well, expert spacing is what makes layouts work properly and look polished. So by the end of this short video, my goal is that you'll be able to make beautiful and functional layouts in Figma and have a way of doing it and a process for doing so. So any type of layout design is about managing spacing, the negative space. This is a key skill, and it starts with handling type. Typographers have a real advantage when moving over to digital design because knowing how to set type properly gives you lots of principles about spacing that you can apply to other graphic elements that you bring into the composition. So let's have a bit of a look at type and then bring that into a wider layout on a website. So looking at this type, first of all, we have all these sort of issues and questions that I've just talked about. Now let's come back to this block, and I want to demonstrate first of all just on a huge headline some of the key considerations. So I've got one prepared here to the side. Let's zoom out back to 100% in Figma, and if I just click on this type here, I've got it set in another width and weight of this same typeface that we're using today, our Kivo, and it is starting off at the same point size 16. So let's change that to something huge like 240 pixels, and then we've got these different options. So first of all, I'm going to go to type settings and I'm going to make this uppercase, and then I'm going to look at this option here, which is leading. They call it line height for digital design, and you'll use that term in code, and we can look at increasing or decreasing this. Now with body copy, we generally wouldn't take it under 100%, we usually go up, but with headlines, especially when they're in capitals like this, you can bring it down and sort of tighten up this whole unit. So about 90% is okay, not too over the top. And then next to it we have letter spacing. Now if you begin to space the letters out, you get these sort of different sort of looks that you can create, but in general, the larger the type, the narrower the tracking, the letter spacing wants to be. So I'll maybe just bring this down to just like -1%, just to tighten that up a little bit. If you see, if we do before at 0 and then after at -1, it just tightens it and make this look like more of a unit together. Okay, let's go back to our body copy and think about how that works. So the same principles here. If we select this body copy, which these longer sentences here, now we already have an okay measure for the web. You wouldn't really want the line lengths to be much smaller than this, but this is okay for a start. But to make this a bit more legible, I'm going to actually increase the leading, the line height. So I'm going to start about 130%, which tends to be my kind of go-to start for body copy, and then I'll bring it up or down from that depending on the particular font that we're using. So this is pretty good. But then we have a paragraph here. So what a lot of people do is just hit a carriage return and have that as a full space there. But that's not like the proper typesetting way of doing it. The best thing to do, if we just delete that carriage return, like we would do in print, and you know, I've in my time, you know, set books and larger documents and things like that, is actually have a paragraph spacing. So we've got it here, so you can start to just push this up, and you don't want it as large as that full carriage return, which was something like that, around 24. So I would bring that down to be something narrower, like maybe 8, and that looks a lot better together, kind of as a unit. Right, now we need to think about this type and how that all goes together and how much sort of space we want between things. Now, this is all about your hierarchy and establishing that hierarchy. And the other principle of layout that you want to think about is grouping or proximity. So every element in your layout is related to one another. So you just have to think about how strong those relationships are. And the stronger the relationship in general, the more connected things are going to be. And often that's by proximity, just putting them closer together. This will become more obvious as we start to, do some real examples. So really, this is almost like one headline where it says Summit the Andes and then it says Machu Picchu Trek. So really, these things don't want to be too far away from another. So I'm going to actually bring everything, sort of closer to one another. So I'm using auto layout on this frame here, bringing this vertical gap down to 4 to start with. Then I want to group these guys together. I'll just put them in a frame there, and so then maybe it's actually this frame where we have that gap. So I'm going to turn that to an auto layout, and that's 4. And then this overall gap between the other 8 items, maybe we're going to increase that a bit. Now hang on a second, how do we know what numbers to choose here? Are we just kind of dragging this thing around and seeing what looks good? Like, okay, like 22 looks good. Well, I think what you need to do is work to a layout system, and it's best to have a consistent mathematics that work through your layout. Now the common one on the web is derived from the fact that this type, like we can see here, is actually 16, because on the web we have something called rems, and this is set in the browser. It's like it means root M, and 1M is like the default font size, and that tends to be 16 pixels in most sort of modern browsers. So based off this kind of math, obviously like 16, the root is 4, going up in increments like 4, 8, 12, 16, 20, 24, and then that's kind of too small in increments. Then we'd maybe jump up in 8s and do 32, 40, 48, etc. Okay, so using this 4/8 pixel grid system, that becomes our layout system that we use. So here I'm not going to just choose random elements like this is a gap of 4 here. I'm not going to then say, okay, now I've done that at 16, but I'm not going to say, all right, now it's going to be like 27, and then the next one's going to be 7, and it's actually following this system so that the gaps go up according to these multiples all the way through. So that's what we're going to start with. So let's bring this into more of a layout. So let's go over to our frame here, and I've just brought in a standard desktop frame. You can just create it here in Figma, the 1440 wide one. And what I'm going to do is add a layout grid in here. Now you can see here we've got a 10 pixel grid, so we might want to say do a 16 or even a 4 if you're really zoomed in, kind of laying out like detailed icons or something, to give us a general idea. But actually what I'm going to do is go over to a column grid, and I want 12 columns, which is the standard one that I tend to use because 12 is divisible by 1, 2, 3, 4, 6 and 12, so it gives me lots of options for layouts. I'm going to keep the setting on stretch, which is going to adjust the size of the column, but then we set the gap. So I'm going to make the margin on each side of the website 64, that's a multiple of 8, and the gutter I'm going to go with half of that. That's the little space in between the columns, and I'm going to set that to 32. So now we have our 12 column layout here that we can sort of begin to work with. So let's bring what we've got over into this and start to do a bit of a layout. Now I had this little type unit that we were using here, but I've actually got 3 of these for this travel website. So I want to create 3 cards. So I'm going to do a little layout for that so we can demonstrate these principles of spacing. And these assets that we're going to use, I just grabbed them from another video that we did, a little layout challenge here on the channel with Maddie. So let's bring these over. So we've got this trip number 1. I'm just going to bring that into this frame for the desktop. And I'm because I've got 3, instead of just doing 3 in a row, which is a little bit boring, we'll do a big one on the left and then 2 smaller ones over on the right here. So let me make a frame. Before I do that, actually, I'm just looking at this big type and there's no spacing around it. So using my principles here, I'm just going to add some padding according to these, multiples. So I could maybe do like 64. Whoops, that's not the right one. That's the gap between. I want this top and bottom padding here, which is okay. Or maybe that's not big enough. So we'll maybe do like a 1 to 8 or something like that. And that goes down to the bottom there. Just make sure our whole frame is snapped to that. Okay, fantastic. So you can see here we've got this this section here of like a big type as we go through a website after these featured ones. And I'm just pressing Shift and G to just turn this grid view off and on. So I want another frame here. So I'm actually going to draw it out just so you can see. I want to go over 6 columns. So there's 3 and then another 1, 2, 3. So that's 640. So let's maybe do a square one. So I'll type in 640 for the height there. The fill, I'm just going to add a white fill because if we turn this grid off, you can see a bit more clearly. We've just got a light grey background on this desktop. If you want to copy this, it's just EA there. So I'm going to put this trip within this frame here. And I want to introduce a photograph. So maybe because I've got 6 columns here, I can bring this trip one over to the right hand side here, and then I can bring a photograph over on this other side. So let me find the correct photograph, and it is this one. I'm just gonna Alt Option copy that down into here. I'm gonna bring it into this frame number 2, and I'm just gonna change the height of it here actually to 640. So that's the exact right height, and then align it to the left and the top. And then I just want to drag the size of it so it covers over my 3 columns, but I'm going to leave the gutter here so that can be our sort of space between. So what I've actually done there by mistake is I've dragged the frame instead of the image underneath, so I'm going to undo that. And I want to make sure it's this that I'm selecting, which now I've got that image, and I'm going to hold down Command, turn my guides back on so I can see what I'm doing. And I'll bring that to 304, which snaps it to there. Okay, let's just recrop this photograph. Fantastic. So now we have a little bit of a layout going on. Now with this type on the left, I want to make sure I can set all these margins completely because this is just floating around at the moment. So what I'm going to do is make this the whole size of this column. If I just drag this over here, and that again, the width should go to 304, and this should be 640. Okay, fantastic. So then I can actually set within here the borders that I want. I'm actually going to go to this frame and rename this left, and I'm going to make a size of rounded corners. Now again, you can just sort of drag this out with your eye and just sort of see when you think it looks pretty good. But obviously we want to use our system, so I'm going to type in 16 rather than doing it at 15. Then this type here, let's select this trip auto layout frame, and let's just set some borders on this. So remember our gutter here is 32, so we probably want to think about that being our sort of padding within this little card. So I could just do this as 32, 32 for these paddings horizontally and vertically. But the problem with that is, well, firstly, we don't need it on the left because the gutter here of the columns already serves as that. So I'm going to do individual padding. I'm going to turn the left one off. And now we can see a bit more if we zoom in actually, it looks like there's more space above this type than to the left, and that's just because of the way these type containers work. So I'm actually going to make here in this frame, I'm going to change this to copy. I'm going to change that slightly here to, sorry, that's just the top bit, isn't it? I'm going to change that to headline. I'm going to change the top padding to 24, so just taking 8 away. And that looks to the eye a bit more correct there. Okay. Right, so this is improved, but it's still, you know, not ideal. So we need to now get this to the point where it's finessed. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring in some icons. So I prepared a couple here in Blue Peter style for all you British viewers. Let's drag the whole frame, calendar icon. And then I've also got this earth icon here. Drag that in as well. Now, because this is on auto layout, they've just gone here in this order. So we want the calendar above the days. And I think what we'll do is put these next to each other. So let's do that for a minute. We're just going to create frames and then auto layouts if you want to just follow along. Make them go sideways. So again here, you see these issues straight away. So first of all, we want to align them centrally, middle, you know, vertically, but from the left. And then again, you've got this gap. So like, what's a good gap? Like this starts to look like unrelated. So we have to think about these principles of proximity when we're doing the frames. Let's just do the same thing with the earth. This, for some reason, has changed its size. Let's change it back. We want to do vertical from the middle, but from the left. So we might want to think about what's a good distance. Again, you don't want it too close. Doesn't look like comfortable polish, but you don't want it too far away. You need proximity. So let's try like 8. That looks pretty good for now. So we'll try with 8. So these things now feel a bit more related. So I'm going to change the name of these. I'm going to group the icon elements. So we've got our headline, our body copy, and our icon. So maybe we might want to then revisit, you know, these sort of gaps, and maybe see what's a good amount. So maybe it's like more like a 40 or something like that. Okay, and we need some sort of button here. So let's add a little bit of this, something for a button. So I'm going to just copy this type here. First of all, I'm just going to duplicate that where it says 5 days. I'm going to take it outside of the flow of this, and let's just write something generic like learn more, something like that. And again, I'm going to bring that into a frame. Let's just give that frame a fill. I've got some colors up here which I prepared, so I'm going to eyedrop that one. It was also there in the bottom, but just so you can see. And again, we've got these questions about spacing. So with buttons, and let's name this button. Let's make it auto layout, so we can just type in our spacing. With buttons, you want to allow, you know, a good bit of space, you know, on the top and bottom, just so they feel like a button. They're easy to click, you know, particularly, you know, when we go over to mobile as well, so people's fat fingers can hit these buttons. So let's, you know, we'll just start with something that's part of our system. So let's do 16 and 8 maybe to begin with. And I think I actually want this as a rounded button. So I'm going to do these round corners here, and I'm just going to give it a big number like 64. So even if our button gets taller, it's a perfect pill shape. Actually, looking at this, we've got another icon we can bring in, which is this arrow here. And let's bring the arrow within the button frame. Okay, cool. So then we'd want to think about the gap in between these things. But you know what I think I might actually do You set that to auto, and I think I'm going to change the width of this button to fill container, so it goes right across here. And then this might look cool kind of at the bottom of this little card. So I'm going to go back over to my whole trip one info, which is all the text here, you see, and I'm actually going to change the gap here that I've been setting manually. Auto would drop this down, but I kind of like those gaps I've established. So what I'm going to do is group the headline, the body copy, and the icons. Let's put them in a frame. Then I'm going to go to trip, and I'm going to change this vertical gap to auto, and that's going to drop because we've got this fixed height, the button to the bottom, so I can keep my side of look. Okay, so far so good. Now this spacing doesn't look even, by the way, where this is placed on the frame, this left. So I've noticed it's 64 from the left because that's what we set there as our outer margin. So let's change the Y to 64 as well. So then we have that good gap around it, and that looks pretty good. Okay, so what we can do now is just copy this guy over, bring our grid back on. So I'm going to hold Option and Shift as I click and drag. Fantastic. And for these next two, we don't have as much information. Let me just cut these. I'm just going to paste them up here. We've just got the body copy after the title, so what I can do is go over to this one that says left. I'm going to change that to right top. Open this up. I'm just going to hide these icons, and then we can update the copy in here, and just make sure you copy whilst holding down Shift. So you, whoops, I chose the wrong one. So you copy the formatting. I actually think maybe we could make this sort of bold, might just separate it out a little bit. Let's change the weight up to bold, and maybe just bring that in at -1% as well. Yeah, that tightens it up nicely. Bold, -1%. Now obviously we've got the height here wrong, because I want two of these, so I'm going to make it half. So you could just go divided by 2, but then obviously we're going to need a gap in between. So this gap here, this gutter was 32, I remember. So if I take 16 off, then I'll have a 32 gap in the middle. So you can just type -16. Fantastic. So we've got that there. Right top. We'll need to change our image, which we can do momentarily. Now it's this one on the right. We've not changed the height of that. So if we change this to 304, our button should appear. Beautiful. And we've already, because of auto layout, all these settings are fine. So let's just quickly change the image and duplicate all the text so we can see what this whole thing looks like. Here we go. So this is our layout that we put together in just a few minutes. And one thing to bear in mind as you create this system is just how we worked in with those sizes. So we had 64 here out on this outer margin, and then we used 32 on the next bit around, and we kind of keep going down like that as we go through. I think this one might have been slightly taller. Maybe we could make that the same, the 32. And then, you know, by the time we had just a gap between an icon, it's 8. So kind of getting the thing on the outside and then working in, you know, is a really smart way of doing it. I'm just looking at that now and I'm not happy with it. So I'm just going to go back in and fix actually all these spaces so that there's a little bit more here. This, instead of 4, let's make it 8 in between these headlines, and then make sure actually this frame is an auto layout, and we'll change this gap to 32 all the way through. And I've already done that over on the left here just to tighten all that up, and I think now that's looking good. So having that system, which is based on the 4, 8, 12, 16, 20, 24, and then 32, and it kind of goes up with the multiples of 8, really helps you make sure that everything feels consistent. It also makes it a lot easier for a developer. And another thing you should do is, this stage is like the experimenting stage. So you should be fooling around and trying out, different larger sizes of gaps and spacing, and trying that on multiple sections. Like we had this next section, we used a much larger padding around this big type than we did around our cards. So just working through that, and then once you've done that experimenting, it's deciding on and then writing out your layout system. So what are going to be the size of the corners, the left and right margins, the vertical padding, the gaps, all the settings for type, like the fonts you're using, the line heights, the letter spacing. Get those things written down. And if you also write down the colors that you've used, that becomes a whole style guide which you can hand off to the developer. The developer will thank you. Or if you're developing this website yourself, then it will really help you as well, save a lot of time, and also work with a lot more accuracy and help the thing all kind of come together. And the thing about spacing is it has to feel right. Aaron Burns talks about this. I've got here actually his famous book, Typography, which was written in 1961. But it's still, a brilliant resource. And if you learn to work with type, you can apply those principles into all your layouts. And he talks about the fact that spacing has to feel right, and it's something that only comes through experience. Let me put this up on the screen. And working with type, it's good training to try increasing or decreasing the space between lines, letters, and words until you begin to arrive consistently at a satisfactory style of spacing that is reflective of your own particular taste. That's what we were just talking about. You experiment, you drag these things around, you try different numbers until it feels right for the project and the feel that you're trying to convey. Squint your eyes when spacing. That's a brilliant tip. And then it'll help you see the overall color. That doesn't mean coloring up the type, so the type is red or blue or green, the actual characters. Color in type is like the weight, the color that it makes on the page, the impression it makes on the page. So squint your eyes and it helps you see the overall color, and will show uneven or spotty color of bad spacing or alignment. And I think if you kind of squint your eyes here, this layout works now because everything belongs to each other. There's good proximate relationships, there's use of scale that brings interests, and it also guides the reviewer around this layout. It allows us to scan and quickly find what they need within this layout. So bring all those principles together, keep practicing, and experiment before you firm up your layout systems, and work to a system, and you'll have great success. Until next time, happy designing.